March 2023, Beijing, China. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sits across from President Xi Jinping, signing an agreement that most Americans have never heard of but will change their lives forever. Saudi Arabia will now accept Chinese yuan for oil purchases, not alongside dollars, not as an experiment, as official payment for the commodity that runs the world. This is the first time in 50 years that oil has been sold in a currency other than the US dollar at scale. The Bloomberg headline is buried on page 12. CNBC mentions it for 30 seconds. The Washington Post calls it symbolic. But in Beijing and Riyadh, they know what just happened. The petrodollar, the foundation of American economic dominance since 1974, just took a bullet to the chest. And it's bleeding out. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the petrodollar is and how it gave America a 50-year free lunch that no empire in history ever had. In 1971, President Richard Nixon did something unprecedented. He took the United States off the gold standard. For the first time since the Roman Empire, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the issuing government. No gold, no silver, no commodity, just trust. And a promise. This was a problem. Why would anyone accept dollars if they weren't backed by anything tangible? The answer came 3 years later in 1974, when Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Saudi Arabia and made a deal that would define the next 50 years. The United States would provide military protection to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, in return, would sell oil exclusively in US dollars, and they would use their influence to ensure OPEC did the same. This was the birth of the petrodollar system. Here's why it mattered. Oil is the most traded commodity on Earth. Every country needs it. Every economy runs on it. If oil is only sold in dollars, every country needs to hold dollars to buy oil. This created permanent demand for the US dollar that had nothing to do with the strength of the American economy. It didn't matter if the US ran deficits. It didn't matter if America printed money. The world needed dollars to buy oil, so the world held dollars. This gave the United States what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called an exorbitant privilege. America could print money, and the world had to accept it because they needed dollars for oil. No other country in history had this advantage. When Rome debased its currency, it collapsed. When Weimar Germany printed money, hyperinflation destroyed the economy. But when America printed trillions, the world absorbed it because they needed those dollars to buy oil. The petrodollar allowed the United States to run massive trade deficits, finance endless wars, and maintain a consumption-based economy that spent far more than it produced. And the world had no choice but to go along with it. Until now. Let's go back to that meeting in Beijing in March 2023. What changed? Why did Saudi Arabia, America's ally for 80 years, agree to accept yuan for oil? The answer is simple. China is now Saudi Arabia's largest customer. In 2023, China imported 2.2 million barrels of Saudi oil per day. The United States imported 1.3 million barrels. China buys more Saudi oil than America does. And China wants to pay in yuan, not dollars. From Saudi Arabia's perspective, this makes economic sense. Why convert yuan to dollars and back to yuan when you can just trade in yuan directly? Why pay transaction costs and expose yourself to dollar fluctuations when your largest customer wants to use their own currency? The Saudis are businessmen. And business is business. But this isn't just about transaction efficiency. This is about geopolitical realignment. Saudi Arabia watched the United States abandon Afghanistan in 2021. They watched Biden refuse to take Crown Prince MBS's phone calls after the Khashoggi killing. They watched America's shale revolution make the U.S. energy independent, reducing Saudi leverage. And they watched China become the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity, the largest trading partner to over 120 countries, and the largest oil importer on Earth. The world is changing. and the Saudis are hedging their bets. Here's what most people don't understand. The yuan for oil deal isn't replacing the dollar overnight. This isn't a light switch, it's a dimmer. In 2023, roughly 15 to 20% of Saudi oil sales to China happened in yuan. That's not most of the oil. But it's not zero, and it's growing. By 2024, that number is closer to 25%. The Saudis are testing the system. They're building yuan reserves. They're developing financial infrastructure to handle yuan transactions. And other oil producers are watching. Russia is already selling oil to China and India in yuan and rupees. The United Arab Emirates opened a yuan clearinghouse in Abu Dhabi. Iraq is discussing yuan payments. Brazil and China agreed to trade in their own currencies, bypassing dollars entirely. The dam isn't broken yet, but it's cracking. And once it cracks, it floods. Let me show you the math of what this means for America. The petrodollar system creates artificial demand for U.S. dollars. Estimates vary, but most economists believe the petrodollar props up the dollar's value by 20 to 40%. Meaning, if every country no longer needed to hold dollars to buy oil, the dollar would lose 20 to 40% of its purchasing power. Let's be conservative and say 25%. If the dollar loses 25% of its value, here's what happens to your life. Imported goods, which represent about 15% of U.S. consumption, become 25% more expensive. Gas prices tied to global oil markets rise 25%. Inflation, already elevated, spikes to double digits. Interest rates, which have to rise to defend the currency, go to 8, 10, 12%. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards all become unaffordable. The stock market, which is priced in dollars, reprices lower as foreign investors dump dollar-denominated assets. Real estate, which foreigners have been buying as a dollar hedge, sees foreign capital flee, crashing prices in major cities. This isn't theory. This is what happens when a reserve currency loses its status. Ask the British. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency for over a century. In 1944, Bretton Woods replaced it with the dollar. By 1976, the UK had to get a bailout from the IMF. The currency collapsed. Living standards fell. The British Empire, already dying, was buried. That's what losing reserve currency status looks like. Now let's talk about how this accelerates. The petrodollar doesn't die in one day. It dies in stages. We're currently in stage 1, alternatives emerging. China and Saudi Arabia trading in yuan. Russia and India trading in rupees. Brazil bypassing the dollar. This is the crack in the dam. Stage 2 is normalization. Other countries see that it's possible to trade oil in non-dollar currencies and start doing it themselves. UAE, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela all begin accepting yuan, euros, or other currencies for oil. The dollar's share of oil transactions drops from 95% to 70%, then to 50%. Stage 3 is diversification. Central banks around the world, which currently hold 60% of their reserves in dollars, start shifting to a basket of currencies. They hold more yuan, more euros, more gold. Anything to reduce dollar exposure. This selling pressure accelerates the dollar's decline. Stage 4 is the crisis. A shock event, maybe a debt ceiling standoff or a recession, triggers a flight from dollar assets. Foreign holders of U.S. Treasuries, spooked by the dollar's decline, start selling. Treasury yields spike. The U.S. government, unable to borrow at low rates, either slashes spending or prints money. Both lead to economic collapse. Stage 5 is the new order. The dollar remains a currency, but is no longer the reserve currency. Trade happens in a basket of currencies. The yuan, euro, and possibly a digital currency become co-equals with the dollar. America's exorbitant privilege is gone. The country has to live within its means. Deficits become unsustainable. Living standards fall. The American century ends. We are in stage 1. China buying Saudi oil in yuan is the crack in the dam. But most Americans don't know it happened. The media barely covered it. Politicians aren't talking about it. But in Beijing, they've been planning this for 20 years. In the early 2000s, China realized it had a problem. It was earning trillions in trade surpluses and accumulating dollars. But holding dollars meant financing America. And America was using those dollars to build military bases around China, fund rivals like Japan and South Korea, and maintain dominance in Asia. China was paying for its own encirclement. Chinese strategists asked a simple question: how do we escape the dollar trap? The answer became clear. Internationalize the yuan. Make it possible for countries to trade in yuan so they don't need dollars. But this required three things. First, China needed to be the largest trading partner to most countries, so they had an incentive to hold yuan. Check. By 2020, China was the largest trading partner to 120 countries. Second, China needed yuan clearinghouses and swap lines so other countries could easily access and use yuan. Check. By 2024, China has yuan clearinghouses in London, Frankfurt, Paris, Sydney, and Abu Dhabi, and swap lines with over 40 central banks. Third, and most importantly, China needed to break the petrodollar. Oil had to be available in yuan. This required convincing oil producers to accept yuan, and the key was Saudi Arabia. For 10 years, China courted the Saudis. Xi Jinping visited Riyadh multiple times. China bought more and more Saudi oil. China invested in Saudi infrastructure, technology, and diversification projects under Vision 2030. And in March 2023, it paid off. Saudi Arabia agreed to accept yuan for oil. The petrodollar just lost its most important partner. Now let's talk about what China gains from this. Every country that trades oil in yuan has to hold yuan reserves. This creates demand for the yuan, strengthening it. More importantly, it reduces global dependence on the dollar. And reducing dollar dependence reduces American power. If countries don't need dollars, they don't need to align with America. They can ignore U.S. sanctions. They can trade with U.S. rivals. They can challenge U.S. dominance without risking their access to dollars. China is building a parallel financial system: the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, cross-border yuan payment systems, all designed to allow countries to operate outside the dollar system. And once enough countries are in that system, the dollar's dominance ends. Here's the part that should terrify American policymakers, but doesn't seem to. The United States is actively accelerating this process. In 2022, the U.S. froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves in response to the invasion of Ukraine. This was unprecedented. Freezing a country's reserves means that holding dollars is no longer safe. If the U.S. can freeze Russia's money, it can freeze anyone's money. Every central bank on earth noticed. China holds over $3 trillion in dollar-denominated assets. After Russia's reserves were frozen, Chinese officials asked a simple question: could the U.S. do this to us? The answer is yes. If China invades Taiwan, the U.S. could freeze Chinese dollar holdings. That's $3 trillion at risk. This makes holding dollars a liability, not an asset. So China is diversifying, buying gold, buying commodities, buying real assets around the world, and most importantly, reducing dollar exposure. By weaponizing the dollar against Russia, the U.S. gave every other country a reason to escape the dollar system. This was a catastrophic strategic blunder. It accelerated the very process that threatens American dominance. Let's talk about the timeline. How fast does this happen? The British pound lost reserve status over 30 years, from 1,944 to 1,976. But that was before the internet, before instant capital flows, before algorithmic trading. Today, things move faster. Once momentum shifts, it accelerates. My estimate is 15 to 25 years from the first crack to the new equilibrium. The Saudi yuan oil deal happened in 2023. That's year zero. By 2030, yuan oil sales could be 30 to 40%. By 2035, 50%. By 2040, the dollar is one of several reserve currencies, not the reserve currency. That's the optimistic timeline. The pessimistic timeline involves a triggering event, a debt default, a government shutdown, a military defeat, something that breaks confidence in the dollar. In that scenario, the transition happens in 5 to 10 years, not 25. And it's not orderly, it's a panic. Capital flees. Treasury markets collapse. The Fed has to choose between defending the currency with 20% interest rates or printing money to prevent a depression. Either choice is catastrophic. What can the United States do? Realistically, very little. You can't force countries to use dollars if they don't want to. You can't sanction China without destroying your own economy. 40% of U.S. imports come from China. Sanctioning China means empty shelves and runaway inflation. You can't invade Saudi Arabia to force them to use dollars. The only real option is to make the dollar attractive again. That means fiscal discipline, balanced budgets, reducing the debt, restoring confidence in American institutions. But none of that is politically feasible. Both parties support deficit spending. Neither will cut entitlements or defense. The debt will keep growing. And as the debt grows, confidence in the dollar erodes. It's a vicious cycle. The very policies that got America here are the policies that will accelerate the decline. The window to fix this was 20 years ago. Today, it's too late. The best America can do is manage the decline and hope the transition is slow enough that the economy adjusts. Here's the bottom line. The petrodollar gave America a 50-year superpower run that no empire in history ever had. The ability to print money and have the world accept it because they needed it to buy oil. That era is ending. China buying Saudi oil in yuan is the beginning of the end. The dam is cracking. Most people won't notice until the flood comes. But by then, it's too late. The dollar will remain a major currency. America will remain a powerful country. But the exorbitant privilege is gone. America will have to live within its means. The trade deficits will have to shrink. The military empire will have to contract. Living standards will fall. This is not a prediction. This is a transition that's already happening. The only question is how fast, and whether America manages it or is destroyed by it. Right now, the smart money is betting on the latter. Let me show you the infrastructure China has built to make this work. The Yuan oil system didn't just appear overnight. China spent 20 years building the rails. In 2018, China launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, where oil futures can be traded in yuan. This was crucial. Oil producers need a liquid market to sell their yuan. The Shanghai Exchange provides that. By 2024, it's the third largest oil futures market in the world after New York and London. China also built the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, which allows banks worldwide to settle yuan transactions without using SWIFT, the dollar-dominated payment network. When Russia was cut off from SWIFT in 2022, it switched to CIPS. By 2024, CIPS processes over 80 trillion yuan annually. That's $12 trillion worth of transactions outside the dollar system, and it's growing 30% per year. China also created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIEB, with 109 member countries. This competes directly with the World Bank and IMF, both dollar-based institutions. The AIIEB lends in yuan, creating more yuan demand. Then there's the Belt and Road Initiative, which has financed over $1 trillion in infrastructure projects across 60 countries. These loans are often denominated in yuan. When Pakistan builds a port with Chinese money, they owe yuan, not dollars. This creates a network of countries with yuan debt, yuan trade, and yuan reserves. It's a parallel financial system, and it's massive. China didn't build this by accident. This was a strategic plan executed over 2 decades. The Yuan oil announcement in 2023 was just the final piece. Now compare this to American policy. What has the U.S. done to defend the petrodollar? Essentially nothing. American policymakers either don't understand the threat or don't care. There's no strategic plan to maintain dollar dominance, no infrastructure investment, no currency diplomacy. The only U.S. response has been sanctions. Sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Iran, sanctions on Venezuela, and every sanction pushes another country toward yuan trade. Sanctions are not a strategy. They're an admission that America has no strategy. Because if your only tool is punishment, you've already lost. China offers infrastructure, investment, and trade. America offers lectures and sanctions. Which would you choose? The American public is equally oblivious. Most people have never heard of the petrodollar. They don't know what it is or why it matters. Politicians don't campaign on it. The media doesn't cover it. So there's no political pressure to address it. By the time the average American understands what's happening, it will be too late. They'll notice when gas is $8 a gallon, when imported goods cost twice as much, when their 401k loses half its value, when interest rates make homeownership impossible. They'll ask what happened, and the answer will be that the petrodollar died and nobody told them. This is not a future problem. This is happening now. Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil in March 2023. That was the inflection point. Everything after that is momentum. The dollar is not going to zero. America is not becoming Venezuela. But the era of American financial dominance, the ability to print unlimited money and have the world absorb it, is ending. And when that ends, America becomes a normal country, with normal constraints and normal living standards, which, for a population that's lived in unprecedented prosperity for 50 years, will feel like collapse. Because in relative terms, it is.